The night Davy's breath began to close, I did the one thing every grown man in Larkspur Bend had sworn he'd die before doing. I saddled a horse in the dark, rode out past the quiet fork to the sweetgrass camp where the cookfires still burned low, and I begged a woman my whole town called a heathen to come save a white child's life. I have lived a long time since that night, long enough that most of the men who would have spit at me for it are under the grass now, and I will tell you plain what it cost me and what it gave me, because a man ought to leave the truth behind him when he goes, and the truth is this. The valley I belonged to was wrong. It had been wrong for years, and it took the dying of its own children to teach it so, and the one who taught it was the one we'd shut every door against. Her name was Naya. I'll get to her. First you should know the boy, because everything I did for the boy. Davy wasn't mine by blood. He was my brother Caleb's son, and Caleb had gone under a wagon 2 springs before, and the boy's mother had followed him inside the year, taken by the same lung sickness that takes so many out here when the cold comes early. So Davy came to me, 7 years old and quiet as a fence post, and I will not pretend I knew what to do with him. I was a widower myself by then. I'd buried my Sarah 4 years before that fever, the same as everyone buries everyone in this country, and I had let my heart go cold and hard as a creek bottom in January, and I'd told myself that was a sensible way for a man to live. The boy changed that, though I fought it. He'd follow me out to the calving sheds before dawn with his shirt buttoned wrong, and he'd stand there shivering and not complaining, and after a while I started buttoning his shirt right myself, and after a while longer I found I could not look at him without my chest going tight in a way I had thought was over for me. By that second winter, he called me Uncle Eli and slept in the little room off the kitchen and left his boots by the stove every night, and I had stopped pretending I was raising him out of duty. I was raising him because he was the only warm thing left in my house. So when the throat fever came to the Bend that fall, and it came for him, I was not a sensible cold man anymore. I was just a man with one child left. It started in the town. It always does. A teamster came through coughing, and within a week 3 of the Ostler children were down, and then it was in the church and the schoolhouse, and it spread the way fire spreads in dry grass, faster than anybody could throw a bucket. The doctors call it diphtheria now. We called it the strangling fever because of what it did. A child would take sick with a sore throat and a low cough, and you'd think it was nothing, and then in a day or 2 a gray skin would grow up across the back of the throat, thick as a hide, and it would close that small windpipe down a little at a time until the child could not draw air. There is no harder thing to watch in this world than a child fighting to breathe and losing. I had thought I'd seen the worst this country could do. I hadn't. Doc Wren worked himself to the bone against it. He was an old man, half-blind, decent, the only doctor within 40 miles, and he did what he knew. He'd had a stock of antitoxin freighted in from back east the year before, and he used the last of it in the first 10 days, and then there was no more, because the spring floods had washed out the trestle at Calder's Crossing, and the rail line wouldn't run again until the bridge gang got out from the territorial seat, and that might be a month, and a child with the strangling fever does not have a month. Then Doc Wren took sick himself. He'd leaned too close to too many small dying mouths, I expect. He was dead by the end of the 2nd week, and we buried him in the rain, and that was when the Bend understood it was alone. I remember the meeting in the church after. 40, 50 people, the pews full of frightened faces by lamplight, and the men standing in the back with their hats in their hands and no plan in their heads. Somebody said send a rider for the army surgeon at Fort Macklin. Somebody said the fort was 3 days off, and the surgeon there was a drunk anyway. Somebody said pray, and we did, and it did not feel to me like the praying went any higher than the rafters. And it was old Garrett Brock, who ran the freight company and half the notes in the valley and considered himself the natural voice of it, who stood up in his good coat and said what a lot of them were thinking but hadn't the gall to say. "We are being judged," Brock said. "This is what comes of a soft territory. We let the heathen camp on our doorstep. We let them range the brakes like they still own them, and the Almighty has taken notice. He let that sit. When this passes, and it will pass, the first thing we do is put them off the sweetgrass for good. I've already wired the agent. There was a low sound of agreement in the church, the kind men make when they want to feel they're doing something, and the only thing on offer is hatting somebody. I didn't say anything. I was as ignorant then as the rest of them. I'd lived 11 years in that valley with the Sweetgrass Band camped not 6 miles from my house, and I could not have told you a single one of their names. I knew them the way I knew the weather, as something that was simply there, that I did not have to understand, that I was free to resent when it suited me. That's the truth, and I'm ashamed of it now. 2 nights after that meeting, Davy took sick. I knew the moment I heard him cough. It was a small, wet bark, nothing, the kind of cough any child gets, and it went through me like a knife because I'd been hearing it from every porch in town for a fortnight. I had him up out of bed and by the lamp before he was even awake, and I held his jaw and made him open and look down his throat the way I'd watched Doc Wren do it, and there was nothing there yet, just red, but his breath when he breathed had the smallest catch in it, like a hinge needing oil, and I knew. I had buried a brother and a wife and a sister-in-law in that house. I knew the sound of the door opening. I want you to understand what I did next, because it was the great hinge of my whole life, and I did it out of nothing but desperation. I put Davy back in his bed and built the fire up and made him a steam of hot water and pine pitch, which was the one thing I knew, and it didn't help. By midnight his breath had a whistle in it. By 2 in the morning he was sitting up because lying down frightened him, his small back to the wall, his eyes too big, working at the air like a swimmer who'd gone out too far. And I knelt by that bed with my useless hands, and I thought of every door in the bend that was already closed against the sickness, and the one door I had never once in 11 years thought to knock on. I'd heard the talk, same as everyone, that out at the Sweetgrass camp there was an old woman, a grandmother, who knew the plants, who doctored her own people through more than one sickness, and that there was a granddaughter she'd taught, a young woman who'd been seen at the trading post and who spoke some English from the mission school years before, and that the soldiers' wives out at the fort had quietly sent for her once or twice when their own surgeon was drunk, and had paid her in coffee and bolt cloth, and told no one. I'd heard all that the way you hear gossip as something not real, but a man drowning will reach for anything, and I was drowning, and so was my boy. I wrapped Davy in every quilt in the house and laid him in the wagon bed, and I drove out toward the quiet fork in the dark, and I forded it where it ran shallow, and I came up on the Sweetgrass camp at the worst hour of the night with a sick child and no right at all to be there. There were dogs first, and then there were men, 3 of them, out of the lodges fast and quiet with the firelight behind them, and one had a rifle and the others had nothing in their hands, but they didn't need anything, the way they stood. I stood up slow in the wagon with my hands open and empty where they could see them, and I said the only thing I had, which was the truth. My boy's dying, I said. The strangling fever. The doctor in town is dead and there's no medicine. I heard there's a woman here who knows the sickness. I'm not here for anything but that. I'll pay whatever's asked, please. The men did not move and did not answer, and I understood every reason they had to turn me around. I was one of Brock's town. They'd have heard, surely, what the town meant to do to them. And here came one of us in the dark, hat in hand, only when his own child was the one with the fever, and not a day before. If they'd turned the wagon and sent me back across the fork, I could not have called it wrong. I have thought about that many times since. But there was a movement at one of the lodges, and a woman came out wrapped in a blanket against the cold, and she said something low to the men, and the one with the rifle lowered it, and she came to the side of the wagon and looked in at my boy. She was younger than I'd expected, not much past 25, with a wide, steady face and her hair in 2 plaits and her eyes the kind that take the measure of a thing all at once and don't flinch from it. She looked at Davy a long moment, listening to him breathe. "How long since the cough started?" she said. Her English was plain and clear, a little careful, the mission school in it. Tonight, the catch in his breath came on after dark. Open his mouth toward the fire. I tilted his jaw and she held a brand from the fire close and she looked, and her face changed, just slightly, the way a person's face changes when a thing they hoped wasn't so turns out to be so. There was the beginning of the gray skin at the back of his throat. She'd seen it before. I could tell she'd seen it many times before. She straightened up and looked at me, and I have never in my life been looked at so directly. "You are from the Bend," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. Your town is going to put my people off this land when the sickness passes. The old man Brock has wired the agent. We know." I had no defense. "I know that," I said. "I'm not here for the town, I'm here for him." She was quiet and the fire snapped, and somewhere a dog settled, and my boy fought the air. And she made her decision the way I would come to learn she made all of them, fast and without fuss once it was made. "My grandmother is too old to ride in the cold," she said. "I will come, but you will hear my terms and you will keep them or I turn around now." "Anything." "You will not tell your town it was us who helped unless I say. I will not have Brock saying my grandmother's medicine is heathen witching over a graveside, and I will not have him saying we brought the sickness. We did not bring it, your teamster brought it." She held up one finger. "That is one," a second finger. "When this is over, you will stand up in your church the way Brock stood up and you will tell them the truth of who saved their children if their children are saved. Not before. After. When it costs you something," a third finger. "And you will speak for us on the land, not because I healed your boy, because it is right and you will have learned it is right. Those are my terms. Do you take them?" I want to tell you I agreed because I was a good man who understood justice. I wasn't, not yet. I agreed because my boy was choking to death, and she was the only soul on earth offering to help. But I have kept those terms every day of my life since, and there came a time, not long after, when I'd have kept them whether Davy lived or died, and that is the whole story of what she made of me. "I take them," I said. She gathered a bundle of things from the lodge, and her grandmother's voice came from inside it, low and quick. Instructions I couldn't follow, and Naya answered short and respectful. And then she climbed up onto the wagon seat beside me as easy as if she'd done it 100 times, and she said, "Drive. And don't run the horse. Cold air will hurt him worse. Slow and steady." So I drove slow and steady back across the quiet fork in the dark with a sick child, and a woman I'd known for 10 minutes, the two of us not speaking, her hand resting flat on Davy's chest the whole way to feel how he breathed. What she did in my kitchen that night, I will carry to my grave. She had me build the fire and set every kettle and pot I owned to boil, and she hung wet sheets near the stove so the whole room went thick and warm and wet as July, and she said the moist air would ease the throat. She made a steam with herbs from her bundle in a bowl and had Davy breathe it under a blanket tent, and the whistle in his breath eased a little, just a little, enough that I started breathing again myself. She brewed a tea, bitter and dark. From a root she had me hold up to the lamp so she could be sure I'd know it again, and she got it into him a spoonful at a time, patient as stone. She watched the gray skin at the back of his throat the way I'd watch a rattler in the woodpile. And twice in the night, when his breath began to close down hard, she did a thing I won't fully describe. With a hollow reed and steady hands and a calm in her face that held me together when I was about to come apart. And both times the boy's chest pulled in clean air again and he slept. Toward dawn the worst of it broke. His fever still ran high and he was weak as water, but the catch in his breath was gone, and the gray skin was no worse, and Naya sat back on her heels by his bed and let out a long, slow breath of her own, and I understood she had been holding herself as tight as I had. "He'll live," she said. "If we keep the air wet and the tea in him for 3 more days, and if the skin doesn't grow again, he'll live." I tried to say something and found I couldn't. I had not cried since I buried Sarah. I sat down hard in a kitchen chair and put my face in my hands, and Naya did me the kindness of looking out the window at the coming light, and pretending not to see. When I had myself in hand, I asked her, foolishly, what I owed her. She looked at me a while. "You owe me what I said you owe me," she said. "Nothing more and not a coin less." She nodded at the chair across from her, the empty one, the one I'd kept set with a plate at every meal for 4 years because I could not bring myself to put it away. "Whose was that?" "My wife's." "How long?" "4 years." She didn't say she was sorry, the way town people say it, the word worn smooth from use. She just looked at the chair a moment longer, and then she looked at me and she said, "You set a plate for the dead. We do a thing like that. Then there is a day you are supposed to stop and let them go on and let the living sit there. You passed that day a long time ago, I think." And she said it without cruelty, the way you'd tell a man his cinch was loose before he climbed on. I didn't move the chair that morning, but I thought about it, which I had not done in 4 years. I will not pretend the town softened all at once. It didn't. The Bend was sick and frightened and looking for somebody to blame, and the sickness got worse before it got better. By the time Davy was up and weakly walking, the strangling fever had gone through half the families in the valley. The Ostlers lost their littlest. The widow Crane lost 2 in a week and went a kind of gray herself and never quite came back. The church bell was tolling so often we stopped counting. And there was no medicine, no doctor, nothing but mothers doing their best with steam and prayer, and their best was not enough, and the small graves were going in faster than the men could dig. I knew what I had in my kitchen, and so help me, the first day or 2 I kept it to myself. Naya had told me to, and there was a low coward in me that was glad of the excuse, because I knew what it would cost in the Bend to be the man who'd gone to the Sweetgrass camp. But Davy was sitting up eating broth and laughing weak little laughs, and 3 doors down the Petrie boy was dying the same death my boy had been spared, and there is only so long a man can sit on a thing like that before it burns through him. I rode out to the camp on the 3rd day. I didn't have to beg this time, though the men still watched me. Naya came out, and before I could speak she said, "Your boy." Sitting up eating, the skins peeled away clean. Something in her face eased that I would come to live for, that small loosening, the nearest she'd let herself come to joy in front of a stranger. "Good," she said. Naya. I'd learned her name by then. I'd asked the boy's name in return and given mine, and we'd done that much. "It's killing the children in town. There's no medicine coming. You and your grandmother are the only people in 40 miles who know how to fight it." I made myself say the rest. "I know what you told me about not telling, but I can't sit in my house knowing what's a day's tea away from a dying child and say nothing. I won't ask you to walk into the Bend. I know better. But would your grandmother teach me and a few women I trust what to do? The steam, the tea, the watching. Could we carry it ourselves? You'd never have to be named." She was quiet, and I saw her weighing it, the danger to her people against the children dying who were no kin of hers and whose families would put her grandmother off her land. And here is the thing about her I want set down plain. She did not hold the town's sins against the town's bobbies, not for 1 hour. "Bring your women to the edge of the fork tomorrow," she said. "My grandmother will come that far. She will show them the plants and the way of it. The root grows along the breaks. I will tell them where. We will keep our hands in it because you will do it wrong if we don't, but quietly. And Eli." She used my name for the first time. "When it is over, you remember the church." "I'll remember the church." So that was how it went, that hard month. Naya's grandmother, whose name I learned was a word the mission people had rendered as Mary, but which Naya called by its true sound that I will not try to spell, came to the edge of the quiet fork wrapped in a red blanket and sat on a camp stool, and taught 4 frightened white women how to fight a sickness that was killing their neighbors' children. She was a small woman, bent, with hands like roots and eyes that missed nothing, and she had no English and didn't need any, because Naya stood by her and turned everything she said into our tongue, and because medicine is the same in any language when you watch it work. I'd brought women I trusted to keep their mouths shut, my late wife's sister Ada chief among them, a wide, capable woman who'd lost her own husband and didn't give a tinker's curse for Brock or his opinions. Ada took to it like a hand to a glove. Within days, she was carrying the root and the knowledge from house to house in town, building the steam tents, watching the gray skin, getting the bitter tea down small throats a spoonful at a time, and never once saying where she'd learned it. The children began to live. Not all of them. The sickness was cruel and it took some no matter what we did. But where before nearly every child who showed the gray skin had died, now most of them lived, and the dying slowed, and then it stopped, and the church bell went quiet, and by the first hard freeze the strangling fever was gone out of the Bend. And nobody in town knew why, except that Ada Hartwell and a handful of women had somehow known what to do. The Bend, being the Bend, decided it had been Ada's own wisdom, or the grace of God, or the strong stock of the valley's people, and it told itself that story and was comforted by it. And Brock stood up in the church the very Sunday after the last child was out of danger, and gave thanks that the territory's good Christian people had weathered the judgment, and reminded everyone that the agent had been wired about the Sweetgrass Band, and that with the spring the breaks would be cleared, and the valley made safe and decent at last. I sat in the back of the church and listened to that, and I thought about my terms, and I thought about Naya standing at the edge of the fork turning her grandmother's words into English so that Brock's grandnieces would live, and the shame came up in me so hot I could hardly breathe. But I'm getting ahead, because in that hard month, while the children were living and dying and the women were carrying the medicine, I had been riding out to the Sweetgrass camp near every day, and I had stopped going only for the medicine a good while before I'd have admitted it. I had told myself I rode out to carry messages between the camp and the women, and at first that was true. But the messages got shorter and the visits got longer, and there came an afternoon I rode out and there was no message at all, and Naya looked at me standing there empty-handed by my horse, and she did not pretend not to understand, and neither did I. I came to know her people that month, a little the way you come to know anybody by being among them. I'd been taught my whole life to think of them as one thing, a problem, a danger, a heathen camp on the doorstep. They were nothing of the kind. They were a band of families, the old and the young, men who joked and argued over horses the way men do everywhere, women who scolded their children and laughed too loud at each other's stories, an old man who could mend anything and a young one who couldn't keep a girl's eye no matter how he tried, and grief in that camp too, plenty of it, because they had lost more than the Bend would ever lose, and not to fever. They had lost a country. They camped on the breaks because the breaks were the broken-up corner of a place that had once been all theirs, range and river and grass to the mountains, and a man in a fort had drawn a line on a paper, and the line had taken nearly all of it, and what they had left they had because nobody white had wanted it yet, and now Brock wanted it. Naya told me these things plainly, not to shame me, though I was shamed, but because I asked, and because she had decided, I think, that I was a man who could learn, and she did not waste herself on men who couldn't. We'd walk along the breaks while she showed me where the medicine root grew, and she'd tell me which draw her grandmother had been born in, back when there was no town and no fort and no line. And I'd look at the country I'd ridden over for 11 years like a man who'd been blind in one eye and didn't know it. And I'll say the other thing, because it's true and a man shouldn't be a coward about the truth even at this end of his life. I had buried my Sarah and let my heart go to creek bottom ice, and I had told myself for 4 years that I was finished with that part of living, and I was wrong. I would watch Naya laughing with the children of the camp, or going still and careful over a sick old man, the way she'd gone over my boy, or pushing her hair back from her face with the back of her wrist after a long day, and the ice went out of me like ice goes out of a river in the spring, all at once with a great groaning crack, and there was no putting it back and I didn't want to. I knew every reason it was impossible. I'd have had to be a fool not to. The Bend would not have it. The agent would not have it. The law in that territory in those years was a hard and ugly thing where it touched her people and me, and her people had every reason in the world to want no part of a man from the town that had broken every promise it ever made them. I knew all that. But there came an evening, the medicine work all done, the fever gone, the first snow holding off, when I rode out and walked with her along the breaks in the long gold light, and I stopped, and I said it. Naya, I'm too old and too plain a man to wrap this up pretty, so I'll say it straight. I have come to love you. I know all the reasons it can't be. I'm asking you anyway because I'd rather be told no by you than yes by any woman in that valley. I'd marry you, by your people's way or mine or both. I'd spend whatever I've got making it so we could. That's the whole of it. You can send me off and I'll never trouble you again, and I'll still speak for your people on the land. I gave my word and I'll keep it whether you'll have me or not. But I had to say it. She didn't answer for a long time. She looked out over the breaks, the country that had been her grandmother's birthplace and was being taken a piece at a time, and then she looked at me, and there was no soft mooning in her face, none of what a younger man dreams of. There was something better. There was the same clear, level, measuring look she'd given me the first night over my dying boy, only it had warmth in it now, way down. You are not a foolish man, Eli Mosley, she said, but there is foolishness in this. Do you understand what they will do to you? You will lose the town. You may lose the ranch if Brock can find a way, and he is a man who finds ways. The agent could make trouble for both of us. My own people will not all be glad of it either. There are those among us who will say I should not look across the fork after everything that has come across it. I am not a prize you win for healing a child. I am a woman with a whole life and a whole people, and I will not leave them, not for you, not for anyone. I wouldn't ask you to leave them, I said. I'd come halfway. I'd come all the way if they'd let me. She studied me. You would learn our tongue. I'm slow, but I'd die trying. You would stand against Brock on the land, in the open, where it costs you. I already gave my word I would. You would put your dead wife's chair away. That one I had not expected, and it went into me deep, and I understood she'd meant it too. I already did, I said. 3 weeks ago, I sat the boy in it, and that was true. Something in her finally let go, the way her face had eased when I'd told her Davy was sitting up. She reached out and put her hand flat against my chest, the way she'd laid it on my boy's chest the first night to feel how he breathed, and she left it there. Then we will see, she said. We will go slow and steady and not run the horse because cold air hurts worse. But we will see, Eli. Yes, we will see. That is the closest thing to yes I have ever been given, and it was worth more to me than any other woman's whole heart laid out on a plate. Because she did not give it cheap, and she did not give it for what I'd done. She gave it for what I might be, and a man will work the rest of his life to be the thing a woman like that saw in him. But the trouble came with the spring, the way she'd said it would. The bridge gang got the trestle up at last, and the rail ran again, and with it came the land agent, a soft-handed man named Reuel with a leather case full of papers, and old Brock met him at the depot like a long-lost brother, and within the week there was a notice posted at the trading post and read aloud in the church. The Sweetgrass Band was to be removed from the breaks by the 1st of June, and resettled on agency land 4 days' ride to the south, dry country, bad water, where another 2 bands were already starving on government beef that came short and rotten when it came at all. Brock had won. He stood up in the church the Sunday the notice was read and called it a great day for the valley, a cleansing, a making safe, and the Bend, which 3 months before had been begging God for its children's lives, said Amen. I stood up. I had been turning it over for weeks, what I would say, and when the moment came I forgot all of it and just said what was true. I told them about the night Davy began to choke, and there was no doctor and no medicine and no hope. I told them I had ridden to the Sweetgrass camp and begged, and that a woman of that band had come back across the fork in the dark and worked over my boy until dawn and saved his life. I told them that it was her grandmother's medicine and her grandmother's knowledge, carried quietly by Ada and the other women, that had stopped the fever in the Bend. I named the children in that church who were alive that morning because of it, and there were a good number, and I named them one by one and watched their mothers go pale. I said that we had begged help of these people when we were dying, and they had given it to us though we'd given them nothing but contempt, and that now, with our children breathing easy in the pews, we proposed to thank them by driving them off the last poor corner of their own country onto land that would kill them. I said I would not have it. I said I had given my word to the woman who saved my boy that I would stand against it in the open where it cost me, and I was standing. You could have heard a pin drop, and then you could have heard the storm. Brock came up out of his pew with his face the color of a brick and called me a liar and a fool and worse, and asked the congregation if they'd take the word of an Indian lover over the safety of their valley, and a good many of them, God forgive them, would. But not all. Ada stood up next to me, broad and unafraid, and said every word I'd spoken was true, and she'd carried the medicine herself and could name the plant and the way of it, and she dared any mother in that church whose child had lived to call her a liar to her face. And the widow Crane stood up, who had lost two and whose third had lived, and she didn't say anything at all. She just stood, shaking with her living child's hand in hers, and her standing was louder than any speech. And one by one, not all of them, not even most, but enough, a few of the mothers stood up in that church and would not sit down, and the thing began to turn. It was a long, ugly fight, and it didn't end that Sunday. Brock had money and the agent's ear and the law's long habit of going his way. But I had something Brock didn't reckon on, which was a valley full of women who knew, now, exactly whose hands had kept their children alive, and a thing a mother knows like that does not unknow itself, no matter what her husband or her preacher tells her. The mothers worked on the men. Ada worked on everybody. I rode to the territorial seat twice at my own cost and stood in front of men in good offices and told the story again, and the second time I had with me a paper that 30 families in the Bend had signed, the same families whose children had lived, saying the Sweetgrass Band had saved them, and asking the agent to let the band keep the brakes. It is a slow rot machine, that kind of thing, and it grinds where it pleases, but a paper with 30 grateful families on it grinds a little too. In the end, Brock did not get his clean sweep. The band kept the brakes by a grudging order that everyone knew could be undone the next time the wind changed, but it held, and it held the next year and the year after that, and a thing that holds long enough sometimes becomes the way things are. I'll not pretend it was justice. It was a crumb where a country had been taken. But it was a crumb wrenched out of Brock's hand by the people who'd have followed Brock anywhere 4 months before, and Naya's grandmother lived out her days in the draw where she'd been born, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, very nearly everything. To the people it was everything too. And there was the water. The breaks ran dry by midsummer most years, which was half of what made the land so hard, and my place sat on the good side of the quiet fork with more water than I needed. So I did the one thing I could do all on my own that no agent could undo, and I opened my water to the band, a standing right, in writing, witnessed and filed, so that come the dry months their stock and mine drank from the same fork, and any man who wanted to put them off the brakes for want of water would have to come through me and my deed first. Brock called it the act of a traitor. Naya called it the act of a husband, which was the first time she'd used the word, and she used it on purpose, and I about fell off my horse. We were married that fall, a year almost to the day from the night Davy began to choke, and we were married twice, once by her people's way out at the breaks with her grandmother saying the words and the whole band there, and a feast that went till the stars came out, and once by a circuit preacher who'd take our money and ask no questions, with Ada and Davy and the handful of Bend families who'd stood up in the church as our witnesses, and Brock not invited and not missed. I learned her tongue, slow as I'd promised, and I'm an old man now and still slow at it, but I can say what a husband needs to say and what a grandfather needs to say, and that is enough. Davy grew up between the two ways, White and Sweetgrass both, easy in each, and he married a girl from down the valley and gave me grandchildren who run wild along the quiet fork the way I once thought no children of two such different worlds ever could. Naya and her grandmother doctored the whole valley for years after, openly in the end, because once the Bend had buried its pride, along with the notion that its children's lives had been saved by anything but its own goodness. It had the sense to come knock on the right door when the next sickness came, and the next one always comes. My Naya is gone now these 3 years. She went the way the very old go, gently in her own bed in our house by the fork, with the grandchildren close and her grandmother's red blanket over her, and I was holding her hand, and the last thing she said to me was in her own tongue, and it was a thing she'd said the first night in my kitchen, when she'd looked at the empty chair I kept for the dead. "Then there is a day you are supposed to stop," she'd said, "and let them go on and let the living sit there." I have not put her chair away. I know what she'd say. I'm an old man and I'll be slow about it, same as everything. But I sit out on the porch most evenings and look at the breaks going gold in the long light. The country that was hers and is her grandchildren's now. The water running down the fork between her people's land and mine like it was always meant to run there. And I think about the night I rode out in the dark to beg a stranger for the life of a child, and how I went out a hard, cold, ignorant man with one warm thing left in his house, and how she looked at me the way no one had ever looked at me. Like she could see the man I had it in me to be, and how she spent the rest of her life making sure I became him. The valley called her a heathen and shut every door against her. And when the worst came, every one of those doors that mattered opened the same way mine did, in the dark in desperation, to the only person who could help. She never once threw it in their faces. She just kept healing them and let the truth do its slow, steady work, the way she did everything, slow and steady, not running the horse because cold air hurts worse. I was wrong about near everything for the first 40 years of my life. I got the last 30 right, and I got them right because of her. A man can't ask for more than that, and most men, I've come to think, get a good deal less.